Hey guys, welcome to the final lecture on muscles. We're going to start today by talking about a few different kinds of muscle contractions. So, if you look at this guy right here, he is doing a basic biceps curl, right? He is flexing his elbow, both elbows, flexing his elbows, and he's using his biceps brachii and other muscles to move these weights. This is an example of what's called an isotonic concentric muscle contraction. It's isotonic, concentric. Okay, those are the two words we use to describe it. Let's start with isotonic first. Isotonic basically means that the weight is not changing. The muscle is going to develop enough tension to move the weight, and it's not going to develop more tension than that or less tension than that. It's going to develop enough tension to move the weight. Concentric first refers to the fact that the muscle cell is shortening. Concentric, kind of like think towards the center here. The ends of the muscle are going towards the center. So pretty much any muscle contraction we think of, when we're bending our elbow with our biceps, straightening with our triceps, anytime we're actively exercising a muscle, we're probably doing isotonic concentric contractions. Now, look at some graphs. If we graphed the tension developed by the muscle, so the tension would rise till it gets to the level we need, and there it would stay. So we develop just enough tension to move the load, and that tension doesn't change. That's what isotonic refers to, same tension. And then we're back to normal. Now, once we develop enough tension, the muscle cells and the muscle as a whole starts to shorten, get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until we start relaxing and we go back to the resting length. All right. Let's contrast. Let's contrast that with an isotonic eccentric contraction. All right, so this guy is lowering this weight, a lot of weight, lowering it onto his chest. So he's not going to let it just crash to his chest. He's going to lower it in a slow, controlled fashion. And when you're doing that, your pec major is getting longer, yet it is still developing tension. So this is called an isotonic eccentric contraction. It generally happens during what's called the negative portion of a movement. If you're a serious weightlifter and you've heard of doing negatives, you know this concept. So in lowering this weight, the pec major is getting longer, but yet we're developing tension. The pec major is acting like a brake pedal on the weight. If you were to slowly extend your elbow, you can feel your biceps brachii get longer and develop tension as you lower it. That's an isotonic eccentric muscle contraction. The muscle gets longer and tension is being developed. Okay, one more to do. The isometric muscle contraction. This is where the muscle generates tension, but it doesn't change length. Notice we had get shorter, get longer, and now staying the same length. Isometric, same length. Isometric contraction. The muscle generates tension, but it doesn't shorten. So in this case, the 6 kilograms attached to the muscle is just too much for the muscle to move. So the muscle will generate tension. It'll pull on the elastic components, the connective tissue components, but the muscle length as a whole will not change. If I look here, here's my tension graph. The muscle generates tension and maintains that tension, but it's not enough to move the resistance, to move the load. And therefore, the length of the muscle never changes. All right, cool. Those are the 3 types of muscle contraction. By the way, I guarantee you will see graphs like these on your test. And you will see pictures of people doing a particular movement. You'll have to tell me what kind of contraction they're doing. All right? So you are forewarned. Okay, awesome. Let's talk about where muscle cells get their energy from. Well, we already know that a muscle cell needs ATP. The myosin needs ATP in order for it to be able to get into its high energy position where it can grab on and move actin. Now, there's lots of ways a muscle cell can make ATP. You can make ADP if you have two molecules of adenosine diphosphate. So that's ADP here and ADP here. There's an enzyme called myokinase, which steals a phosphate from one of these ADPs and sticks it on the other, giving us adenosine triphosphate and also adenosine monophosphate. This is an example of what's called phosphate transfer, where I'm moving a phosphate from one thing to another to make ATP. Our muscle cells don't store a lot of ATP in them, so we will quickly rely on phosphate transfer to supply some energy. Another way we can make ATP is to take an ADP and a molecule called creatine phosphate, abbreviated CP here, and there's an enzyme called creatine kinase, which rips a phosphate off creatine phosphate, leaving just creatine, adds the phosphate to ADP, leaving adenosine triphosphate. So these are two quick ways a muscle cell will generate ATP. And these are both examples of phosphate transfer. Now, let's get out of here. There we go. Another way to make ATP is this process called glycolysis, which maybe you talked about that in your general bio class, or if you took micro, maybe you've done glycolysis. What we're going to do is we're going to break down a molecule of simple sugar called glucose into two molecules of something called pyruvate. And in doing so, we will make a net of 2 ATPs, because I'll use 2 ATPs in order to do glycolysis, and I'll end up making 4 ATPs. And I'll also make up this energy storage compound called NADH. I'll make 2 of those. So I can use glycolysis to make pyruvate, 2 ATPs net, and 2 NADHs from each molecule of glucose. Now remember, we store glucose in this branched chain called glycogen in our muscle fibers. Okay, what else? Well, what I can do is I can take that pyruvate and I can turn it into something called lactate or lactic acid, which is another nutrient source often used by your heart muscle and your liver. So maybe you've heard of lactate, maybe you've heard of lactic acid before. Okay, now glycolysis happens in the sarcoplasm, but inside the mitochondria, we can do aerobic metabolism. Aerobic meaning we're going to require oxygen. So the pyruvic acid made from glycolysis, it doesn't have to become lactate. If there's oxygen available, we can put it in the mitochondria and use it to make more ATP. Pyruvic acid goes through something called the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle, and it is going to make a lot of ATP and a byproduct of CO2. There's another component called the electron transport chain that we're going to use as well in our mitochondria. We're going to make a lot of ATP from it as well. Usually around 32 ATP per molecule of glucose. So we're also going to make CO2, we're going to make water, we're going to make heat as a consequence of this. So aerobic metabolism is going to take place in your mitochondria. We're using the pyruvate made from glycolysis as well as the NADH, and we're using the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain to make a lot of ATP and also to make CO2, heat, and water. Now, bear in mind, I am not going into detail on these processes here. I mean, if you take a cell biology class, if you take a biochemistry class, you'll go into a lot of detail. Just want you to realize we store a little bit of ATP in muscle cells. We use phosphate transfer to make a little more. We use glycolysis to make more, and that doesn't require any oxygen. But if we have oxygen, we can use the products of glycolysis in our mitochondria to do the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain and make a lot more ATP. Really, doing it aerobically is the best way we make the most ATP. So I don't want you to get into more detail. Don't go crazy researching all these things. All right. With that, let's talk about muscle fatigue. Lots of things can cause muscles to fatigue. Okay, in the muscle itself, we can run low on glucose and glycogen. We can run out of calcium. We can have a buildup of hydrogen or ammonia or a buildup of phosphates. All of those contribute to muscle fatigue. On the nervous side of the equation, the neurons can run low on acetylcholine. Think about it, if you don't have acetylcholine, you can't stimulate your muscle. Electrolyte levels of sodium and potassium can go awry, and that can also lead to fatigue. So this fatigue is happening in the motor neuron, in the muscle cell. It is an example of something called peripheral fatigue, which means it's happening in the muscle fibers or in the motor neurons. There's also central fatigue, which happens in the central nervous system, in your brain, in your spinal cord. Because there's the perception of fatigue. And sometimes perception is the reality here. Now, central fatigue occurs in your higher brain centers and in your lower brain centers, so brain and spinal cord. And one of the things going on here is central fatigue is where your nervous system is monitoring what the muscles are doing and kind of saying, you know what? We need to shut things down. We don't want to get hurt. Central fatigue is usually the kind of fatigue you're used to. Think about this. What would you do better at? When would you run faster? Let's say you were running a mile on the track by yourself. All right, you run a mile as fast as you can by yourself on a track at the local high school, college, whatever. So you run that mile. Or let's say you're running a mile at the same track, but you're racing against your arch nemesis, your number one enemy. And all the people you care about are there cheering you on, yelling for you, screaming your name. Which one are you going to do better in? Or is this you? Or are you against your enemy with all your cheering the cheering adulations of your fans? Definitely number two, because central fatigue can be overcome to a degree. And that's where we see things like the effect of crowds, the effect of competition, that they can play a role. And again, folks, we're doing just like a very general introduction here. This concept of fatigue is a lot more complicated than I'm making it out to be. All right. Cool. Let's do another quick little topic here. There is something called oxygen debt. This looks like an awesome hill. Let's say you were going to go and do some sprints up this hill. You sprint up this hill. When you're done, there's a period of time where you are in what is called oxygen debt. You are gasping for breath for a while, even though technically you're done exercising. All right, why are you doing this? Well, the basic thing is you got to restore your resting state. And the oxygen debt is going to help you do that. And it'll persist actually for longer than just the huffing and puffing period lasts. You could be in oxygen debt for a little while. Well, what do you got to do? Well, think about the things that led to fatigue, the running out of glycogen and glucose. All right, the buildup of phosphates, the loss of calcium, the buildup of hydrogen and ammonia. Well, you got to get rid of that hydrogen, get rid of that ammonia, get rid of that phosphate. You got to reset your levels of calcium, sodium, and potassium. You got to bring your stores of glucose back. You got to rebuild glycogen. You got to get more acetylcholine back. All of these things require energy. Require ATP to do all these things. To make more ATP, you need oxygen. So you are in oxygen debt. And the best example is that period of huffing and puffing when you're done exercising. All right. So we're flying through. I'm hoping this will be a shorter lecture for muscles than the first two. There are actually different kinds of muscle fibers. There's red and there's white, also called slow twitch and fast twitch. Got two delicious birds here, a duck and a chicken. If we look at a chicken breast is classic white meat, right? Whereas the chicken thigh is classic dark meat. It's actually different kinds of muscle. The white meat, so the white muscle fibers, which are the fast twitch muscle fibers, also called glycolytic muscle fibers. Then the thigh is the dark meat, the red muscle fibers, which are the slow twitch, also called the oxidative. And they do different things. The white muscle fibers are better able at powerful movements, short bursts of powerful contractions. The red muscle fibers are better for endurance type things, long sustained contractions that require lots of oxygen use. Think about it, chickens don't fly very far. If you compare a chicken breast to a duck breast, I got ahead of myself there. Duck breast is dark meat because ducks fly for a lot longer than chickens do. Chicken breast is white meat, just for like a quick, powerful burst of contraction to get away. Chicken thighs, though, are dark meat because chickens, strut about all the time. All right. If we look microscopically, we got the red muscle fibers up top, over here as well. White muscle fibers down below. The red muscle fibers have a greater blood supply. They have more myoglobin for oxygen storage, and they have more mitochondria. The white muscle fibers generally have more myofibrils, more enzymes for glycolysis, but don't have the oxygen supply or oxygen utilization. If we compare them, all of our muscles have a mix, by the way. You're not either one type or another. Fast twitch muscle fibers, the white ones, are very good for sprinting type activities, like powerful bursts. Long distance running, you can rely on those slow twitch. And there's a happy medium as well. Now, your particular combination depends on your mom and your dad. Genetics are what's going to determine what you've got. If you are naturally good at long distance running, then you probably have a higher proportion of the slow twitch fibers. If you're more of a sprinter, a long jumper, then you've got more of those fast twitch fibers. And thank your mom and your dad. Now, training can get both of them to do better, but you can't switch from one kind to another. But training can get you better and better. You can improve your endurance, you can improve your power, your sprinting, of course. All right. Speaking of training, let's suppose you decided to run a crazy race called the Badwater Marathon, which is where you run from the lowest point in the contiguous United States, called Badwater, to the highest point, the peak of Mount Whitney. This is in California, by the way. And it's 135 miles that you run from the low spot to the high spot. Let's say you decide to train for that. All right? Doing a lot of endurance training like these two monsters right here. These guys are ridiculous. As you train for your race, you will grow more blood vessels. Your capillary density will increase. Your myoglobin stores will increase. So you can store more oxygen in your muscle cells. Your glycogen stores will increase. You can store more glucose. Your capacity for lipolysis, that is a fancy way of saying your ability to break down fat, will improve. You will grow more mitochondria. Mitochondria will reproduce in your muscle cells. your mitochondrial density will increase. You will store more ATP and you will store more creatine phosphate. You will generate a better tolerance to levels of lactate that could otherwise lead to fatigue. So these are all benefits to endurance training. It's also resistance training, of course. And both these things are good. We should do both. We should do things that develop our endurance and develop our ability to move heavy loads. Now, resistance training looks like this young lady is about to, let's say she's about to do a front squat with that weight right there. Doing so would be a great example of resistance training. And in response to resistance training, our muscles will hypertrophy. The fibers get bigger. Bigger muscles can generate more power. We'll have more ATP and more creatine phosphate for more quick energy. More enzymes for glycolysis for more quick production of ATP. We will increase the number of myofibrils in our muscle cells. That's one of the causes of hypertrophy. And we'll generate more power. All right. You know what? Best news in the world. AMP1 lecture is done. Congratulations. You made it through all these lectures. Give yourself a pat on the back. Good job. Get ready for that final test. And I will talk to you guys later.